Hi and good morning, I'm Dan, I'm with UTD, I'm out at the Now Dive in Denmark, and this morning we'll be following up on yesterday's talk about the 10 most wanted improvements in Scuba. Number 5 on the list was the use of checklists, or rather than increased use of checklists, and that's fair enough. But I want to just dig into that point, or rather that topic, because checklists are many things, and they can work in a lot of different ways, and they can try to or aim to achieve a lot of different things. So I found a piece of reading material yesterday that I've been following up on. It's called "The Problem with Checklists" by Catchpole and Ross. It sounds somewhat ominous, but it highlights a lot of really interesting things that I think are worth looking at if one is interested in more in-depth views on checklists and how they work. Now, some of the things that they mention in this report is that there are many different ways to do checklisting, or to use checklists. And they've looked at different sectors like healthcare and aviation, and how they to come up with a few examples. For instance, when you prepare a complex piece of machinery like an aircraft, you want a simple checklist that says, just, is this in this setting, or is this on, or is this off, or all these things, and you can go through it and go check, 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 and that works very well. Now, in another setting, which is, for instance, when preparing for a surgery, a medical team might not have the same benefits or the same requirements for a checklist. They'll need something to help stimulate maybe more of a conversation about what is it we're about to achieve, and who does what, and all these things. So that's a completely different thing from making a piece of equipment function, right? So personally, I come from a military background, and I used to work with anti-submarine warfare. And one of the tools we'd use is a sonar, right? So we'd have a sonar on board, and it would be a relatively complex piece of machinery, and preparing it so that it would work optimally would be a relatively difficult thing to do, right? You could get it to work easily, but getting it to work well would be more of a task. Now, the difference is that the reading you get is more or less accurate, right? The difference that it isn't is that you can't get the sonar, you can't break the sonar by doing it kind of wrong, you know? So it would be more in terms of how accurate you're going to be as an operator. So that would be a different kind of employment. As divers, we also have some different views on what we want to achieve. For instance, if we're wanting to get a rebreather ready, it'll maybe resemble a little bit more how we worked with sonars in the military. It'll be a relatively can be long period of time where there's loads of possibility to be distracted, and you're doing it on your own. So that can be a bit of a challenge there. On a different way that we might use the checklist is if, as a team, we are trying to get ready to do a dive, and we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page about what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, the when, the where, the how deep, and all this stuff. Again, this is something where the checklist might actually, rather than getting a piece of equipment to be ready, it might be, the goal of the checklist might rather be to ascertain that there's a reasonable conversation about all of these things, that everybody's on the same page, that there's a milieu of exchange, if you will. So it's a very complex matter, and I think that using a checklist can be a crutch, right? If we don't know what the system that we're dealing with, how that works, and we're using the checklist solely as a backup to our understanding and our perception of things, just to, like a catch-all before we jump in, but rather use the checklist as our primary mode of understanding or using or employing or preparing, then we risk a complex issue in that piece of equipment to trick us up as well, especially if it's a checklist that lasts a while and requires us to be fully focused throughout, because that, then we might get distracted, miss a step, forget to flick on an O2 tank or whatever the case might be. Just look at analyzing tanks before even leaving the dive center. That you can get it wrong already there by analyzing and labeling wrong. So there's a lot of risk from being distracted that we need to mitigate. And checklists don't necessarily, and very often do not, deal with that. They don't necessarily deal with being on a boat where there are 20 other people throwing fins around and getting ready for the dive. And they don't necessarily deal with you have a lot of things to do. And there might be all these other factors. So I think that using the checklists wrong can be every bit as, or rather over-relying on a checklist, can be every bit as dangerous as omitting to use one can be. So the bottom line is, the right person with the right skill in the right team in the right environment, this is also mentioned in the report, can use the right checklist the right way to get a very good result. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can put all of our faith into the checklist unless we've absolutely ascertained that it does what we want it to do, and we're clear about what it does and what it does not. So if we go, let's have a checklist for our equipment, right? What I do personally is I do top down, right? I start with my primary regulator, check, that's there in place, it's working perfect, the necklace perfect, and then I continue on down to see if everything is in place, and then I look around at my team and ascertain that their stuff is also in place and working. And by the time I'm done with that, that'll be all the equipment checked. But if my checklist is to make sure, right, all of this gear is in place, then I'm not really having that conversation with the team, and they can't look at me looking at them, right? Bottom down, like doing the elevator look to find out if everything is in place. So there's definitely some give and take, like a social thing relating to preparing for a dive as well. My dive buddies, they can look in my eyes and they can see, right, he is now no longer looking at himself, he's now looking at me. Perfect. That means he's in that place, and they can also check me out while I'm at it. So that's something to look for as well. But a checklist doesn't do that, really, though, does it? And I think that there's a risk of overemphasizing or replacing that discipline and getting oneself prepared, used to getting prepared for dive, replacing that with a checklist, because checklists don't do all of the job for us in many cases. So yeah, that's definitely an interesting thing, because we can always, if there is an accident in Scuba, we can always go back and say, well, if we'd done the checklist, here's a piece on the checklist that would have made sure that didn't happen. But that's always after the fact. That's always after, well, yeah, but he was distracted. Maybe it's because the checklist itself or the way it's employed might not fulfill all the needs that relate to diving. So that's something that obscures the fact as well, and I think that's an interesting aspect of it. So we've talked a little bit about checklists and what they're good for and what they maybe not do for us on their own, and we've talked a little bit about complex machineries like sonars and rebreathers and aircrafts. So tomorrow I want to follow up on systems and human-machine interfaces. I want to talk a little bit about automated systems and how we use them, and follow up and expand a little bit on this idea of us understanding a complex landscape of systematics and what happens which challenges we might all of a sudden be looking at. I found an interesting report to read up on tonight. It's a bit of a lengthy one, so I'll jump to it relatively soon today, and probably not be done with it before tomorrow morning sometime. I won't be reading all through the night. I'll just need to recap in the morning. And then we'll sit down and have another chin wag about human-machine interfaces in automated systems. All right. Quite nerdy, but something I'm quite interested in, and for all the rebreather divers out there, certainly something that's interesting to look at. Right. Thanks for your time. If you feel like staying in touch and hearing more about what I'm up to, you're more than welcome to following my page, UTD Norway. And other than that, I just want to wish you a great day and safe diving.